How many have you guys been telling yourself that when you were little? Welcome. Welcome everyone to our next Gateway series on this special event on empowering yourself now and reclaiming your identity. So this is a special event that ALA, NAP, and ADLSF will be hosting. And in honor of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. As we all know, the community has came together a lot recently with the rallies and speakers coming up to speak on this. And now we want to just go back and celebrate our diversity, celebrate who we are, celebrate our cultures, our traditions, and basically accept who we are. And before I introduce our speaker, anyone else that have questions can message Brian Pang or Daisy Shea for questions. And we also have, there's another announcement that we also want to make. Hold on. So one of NAP's organization from NAP, he will be hosting a documentary on basically anyone that basically changed their names from their birth name to their English name. So he will be posting that in the chat box for more information. And now I want to introduce our speaker, Farzana. Let me give you a little background about her. So she is recognized as a diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist, business and strategy coach, and international keynote speaker. She has worked with Fortune 500 corporations, public agencies, higher education institutions, school districts, and nonprofit organizations as a consultant and trainer on diversity and inclusion, intercultural communication, supplier diversity, and employee engagement. Her advisory work with ERG and small business advocacy and entrepreneurship and racial equity and inclusion has taken her to engagement across North America, from the White House to Silicon Valley. So now I want to welcome Farzana. Thank you again for agreeing to speak with us, and happy Asian American Heritage Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Thank you again, Farzana. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Ramon, and welcome everyone. It's so great to be here. Happy AAPI Heritage Month. Want to just start off by honoring the native lands that we're on, the indigenous lands. Most of us may or may not know the names of the lands that we're on. So if you go to native-land.ca, you could look that up. And it's important to honor the lands that we're on to preserve the connection to the indigenous history and the awareness of colonization of these lands. So welcome to our talk today. Our discussion today is about reclaiming our identity, and it is so important to note that we're in the balance of the celebration of this as our month for our honoring our identities, but then also that we're in the current times, which are extremely difficult. So today I'm going to go ahead and get started and just start to share some thoughts for our discussion today. We'll have a chance to move into some conversation and also be able to talk together. So let me just share screen and make this a little bigger. Sorry, 1 second. It's not expanding for me. 1 second. There we go. And in terms of our conversation today, really bring in who you are and think about, your own situations and your own identities. And that video we just saw, for those of you who were able to see that music video, was so powerful because we were able to look at someone who went through negotiating their identity as a child and then into adulthood. And so maybe after today, for those of us who didn't see that video, we could share that out, or put it in the chat for that video. So our conversation today is empowering yourself, reclaiming your identity. And we'll have time today to explore this and think about what it means for us. What was mentioned today was a little bit about my background as a DEI consultant and coach. I also want to share that I do, energy work around connecting to our ancestors and also supporting healing in our communities. This has been something that has developed over time. And as someone who's Filipina and Pakistani, is part of my heritage. And I want to just share that it's important for us to think about this as healing as well as awareness. In terms of our agenda for today, we're going to look at our identity as Asians and looking at the historical impact in the current times of being an Asian person, and how that is treated in this dialogue today, defining and empowering ourselves now and next steps, and thinking about Q&A, and what is on our minds that we want to discuss together. So let's start off with that. Just want to start off by asking you in the chat, who are you? So being someone who is Asian, what country are you or is your family from? So you may have been here for generations. We want to honor the heritages that are in the room. So if you can put in the chat where you come from, that would be really helpful for our conversation, so we can see who is here in the room today. So let's go ahead and start to share. We can see in the chat, in terms of the discussion, thank you for sharing that you are third generation. We have Chinese American, we have Hawaii, we have Shenzhen, Taiwan, Chinese American, South Korean, China, Korea, India, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Pakistan. And just look at everyone coming in and sharing who they are. And maybe, it goes back one generation, two generations, or three generations or more. We are a diaspora as the Asian community, and we have lived on other lands, and we're on this land that, we've settled on. And so what's our connection back into the history of that? As we start to honor who's in the room and who we are, something to note is that Asians are not a monolith. We can't say that we're all the same. We definitely have commonalities, but I want to also acknowledge that there are differences amongst these groups. And sometimes part of our advocacy is coming together and saying that we're the same. But then in this room today, we also want to honor that we're very different. So let's hold both of that at the same time. Okay, so next question is this. What does being Asian mean to you in terms of how does it look like to you? So what are your communication norms? And again, I know that these are general questions, but growing up, and this is something I can ask in this way. What were some of the messages you were taught growing up by your family or your ethnic community? So in terms of communication norms, so it's just starting with communication norms, what were things that you were taught? So one example could be, in terms of, speaking up, like wait to be asked a question before speaking up, or something like that. Okay, so we have here, these are starting to come in. Never speak your mind. And, these are related to the next question, which I'll get to in a second, around cultural values. But what are some things that are communication norms? And it might be that you don't disagree with someone. So I would put that, don't disagree with, other people in front of them. Here we go. And if we want to move into, some of these examples here, don't air out family's dirty laundry, speak respectfully, don't share about family dynamics. listen to elders. Okay, so let's move into also cultural values. So these are combining together communication norms and cultural values, respecting elders, greeting elders. We have a lot of stuff around, not discussing inner family stuff. How about creating harmony, and saving face. Saving face is when, we don't want to damage the reputation of other people. So we might actually take the blame for something. These are cultural norms. And what happens though is that when we're in a collective society, these actually function really well, right? Because we are in harmony with each other and we're thinking about each other and other people are thinking about us. The thing though is that when we're in an individualistic society, i.e. where we are now, it's not looked at the same way, right? Does that make sense? So we're moving from a collective group into an individualistic society. And I know these are kind of like generalizations, but how were these norms and values perceived by others then? They work in our home, they work in our community, they work at our religious faith institutions, and in our family households. Well, how are these norms and values perceived by others? So go ahead and put in the chat. How are these norms and values perceived by others? And again, I understand that these are generalizations, but there's some threads of common unity here. Okay, so here we go. So norms and values that we value around being harmonious and collective could be seen as passive, weak, submissive, quiet, strict, subordinated, distant, invisible. Do you see how this is all coming in? Weak, and how, how is this viewed as in terms of how you lead? Maybe you lead in a way that's collective minded. You build consensus. And instead of these things being seen as positives, they are misperceived. Does that make sense? So these values, which could be positives, these values which could add to a team, these values that are actually treasured, could be misperceived into looking at being looked at as a deficiency. And that you'll put up with, we have in the chat, you'll put up with the drama, you'll put up with things. And so this misperception is at the crux of how we have not advanced into leadership roles, how we have not moved into positions of power, how we have been subject to anti-Asian racism because we are seen as that type of group. That is a problem. Okay. Now, how do we address that? How do we, that's the question at hand. How do we reclaim our identity? How do we empower ourselves in the midst of this misperception? And the key here is knowing that it's a strength. The key here is knowing that by and large, the harmony we create as a collective is a powerful thing that you can bring to a team. So I want to set the scene about how, just as we walk through the door, we haven't even talked about history or current times yet. What's your reaction to this when we frame it? And just so we're here talking as a community together about this. What is your reaction? So go ahead and put in the chat, or if anyone wants to share out loud, what's your reaction when you hear this and we're talking about it? And we may not always be able to talk about it, but we're talking about it now. What's your reaction?
I think we should do a better job of, as a community, to show that these are actually strengths. I don't think we have been, I feel we have not done a good job in showing this as a strength.
It's a strength, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So how can we show it as a strength? Okay. Thank you for that. We have someone say here in the chat, we can choose to change the narrative and that this makes sense. It's a helpful paradigm. I'm going to tell you one thing that I'm not going to teach today. I'm not going to teach that you need to change, because that's a deficiency minded model. That means that we are the problem. Like, I've been to, I don't know how many meetings at the White House where the API commission has asked us to go, and we talk and we always end up the same thing. like we need to be stronger, we need to be this, we need to be that. That's not necessarily the problem here. What is the problem is the social structures that keep us from being perceived with our strengths. And when I do DEI work, there's this thing called, like, when Asians come from Asia and come to America, there's an actual name for what happens to them. They call it the career killing fields. So executives who come from Asia to America know that their careers are going to take a hit because they're misperceived because of these dynamics. So that means that people can succeed in areas where the collective is collective minded. And I want to put forth a very strong statement here that you're on point. You're on point by saying we need to change the narrative, not necessarily change ourselves. Okay, sure, we can do things in meetings and that sort of thing. But I don't want us to walk out of here and say, like, we're deficient. That's the wrong way of looking at it. Okay, thank you. So let's keep going. Hey, what else is going on here? There's something called intersectionality, where there's you and, you know, ethnic identity as being an Asian person is one aspect of this, but being an immigrant is another aspect of this. So so another variable could be, and there are many variables, like imagine a lot of ovals and not a lot of circles. There is other variables here, like your immigration status. Maybe you're on an H-1B. Maybe you're newly immigrated, right? And how does that affect you and your power and your positionality? Maybe you can't take the job you really wanted to, or you can't, like, start that business. And so these constraints are real in our community. Another variable could be your gender identity or expression. And so depending on your gender, you could be perceived that way. And so there's that intersectionality that's a part of this that we can't ignore. That's super important, and also is so great. There's so much diversity in our community that we need to uplift and showcase. So yes, we have some comments here about how this is a both and how we feel, what we feel drawn to, leaning into thinking of what collectivist strengths look like for me versus changing the individual perceptions of other people. Sure, you know, how we show up and how we lead is important. And today we're going to look at how to take the idea that we can do this together forward. So just want to be aware of the intersectionality of what is at play here. Another component of who we are and reclaiming ourselves is understanding our history. And depending on how much you've been exposed to Asian American history or Asian history in general globally, you may or may not be aware of, like, all the different facets of society. And I'm not going to go into every aspect of this, but there are so many components of the fact that, you know, the Chinese helped create the railroad, and there was the Chinese Exclusion Act at the same time, or that Filipinos were cannery workers and also supported the farm workers movement and didn't get as much awareness about that. Did you know that it was Vincent Chin's birthday yesterday? So rest in power, rest in peace, Vincent Chin, who was murdered in the 80s because he was mistaken for being a Japanese auto worker. And there was so much hate for the Japanese during the recession of that time in the automobile industry, and so on and so forth. And yet at the same time, there's so much pride in our communities. There's so much in terms of what we've given and enriched the community for, and the leaders we have. There's so many leaders we have in the political sphere and art and culture and entertainment that we can be proud of. Look at the richness of this mural. So part of our you know, connecting back with our culture is you know, reaching back into those stories and knowing them. A really good documentary I recommend everyone watch is by PBS. It's Asian Americans, and it's free. It's a 5-part series. I highly recommend it. It gives you a primer on everything from the plantation history of Hawaii to what has happened here on the mainland, and then, you know, just catching up on all of those factors. And you know, to the point in the chat about not learning Asian American history until way later, you know, a lot of people haven't. So we are missing that gap in our pride of understanding our positionality in this country. Thank you for that, putting the link in. So that's your homework. maybe there can be an ALA watch party around this, because I really think that debriefing after each segment might actually be interesting. So highly recommend that. Now, the historical treatment of our community also has not been very positive. We've been displaced, we've been, perceived in certain ways, and there's been actual structural issues that have affected us. And, part of, after you understand that, and let's say you watch the documentary, that gives you an insights into how we're perceived. And so what does this lead to? It leads to the model minority myth. I'll send around, I actually was interviewed this last week on the news about the model minority myth. So I'll send it around. It's a 6-minute segment about the model minority myth and how it affects us. But what is it? It's basically a contrived conception that we're all like super successful. We don't need help. We're all studious and docile and geeks and whatnot, right? And what that does is it creates a wedge between us and other communities, because we're pitted as the ideal. And if we can do it, how come the other communities, fill in the blank, can't, right? And so it makes it very difficult for us to position ourselves to ask for help or to be perceived as needing help. There's also the perpetual foreigner. So who here has always been asked, like, even though you live here, it's like, where are you from? No, in New York, no, where are you from? No, like, where are you really from? And it's like, I'm speaking English, and even if I wasn't, I could belong here. So that is the perpetual foreigner. Like, they say, like, the melting pot, you put people in the melting pot, but when Asians come out, they haven't melted. Like, sad, but like, we're always seen as not having assimilated. And so sometimes people have to like overcompensate and show that they're more American, or show that they're more, a part of the culture wherever you are. And then you have to start shedding who you are. You have to start like talking and walking and communicating and behaving and making decisions that are, more away from culture that you grew up with, because you've had to grow into that. And so, how does this affect us? Well, first of all, it impacts the perception of how we see ourselves, and how we're perceived by others. And in addition to that, we start to internalize it. So in terms of this, a question for everyone here: how have you been affected by the model minority myth or the perpetual foreigner? And the bottom bullet here is about how intersectionality plays a role. But how have you been affected? Let's open it up for conversation. How have you been affected by the model minority myth or being a perpetual foreigner? Being perceived as a perpetual foreigner. At work or in the community.
I would say, like, in the past, I've had people tell me that I'm only good at things because I'm Asian. Like, oh, well, you did good at that because you're Asian. Like, it's inherent that you're going to be good at that, which kind of makes me feel like I didn't work as hard to get the things that I did.
So your abilities are equated with that stereotype. Okay.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Thank you. We have in the chat, passed up for leadership positions. Probably do the put your head down and work, like we're worker bees. We have here, I've been asked what my nationality is when they met my ethnicity. So mixing that up, and the perpetual foreigner at play. I'm always asked why I do not have an accent. I've been asked that actually as well. I was on a plane once, and the person next to me who I had a 4-hour flight with said, wow, if I close my eyes and heard you, you wouldn't look like how I pictured you to look. Like, my gosh, This was like an executive at a, very well-known company too. I love travel and road tripping around the US, but this always makes the issue. This is always the issue that makes those trips less fun, I guess, because people are asking where you're from. Comments from restaurant owners and hotel staff. Hey, your English is so good. Okay, there's also with the workplace, expected to overwork. Your talents and intelligence are downplayed in school. Why don't you work in IT? So for those of us in creative or other pursuits, the expectation of being a lawyer, doctor, all of that. And then, by the way, like when people in prominent positions or celebrities who say things like, well, I'm good at math because I'm Asian, right? Like it just plays into it. I think that's my biggest critique of people who say, oh yeah, of course I've done this because I'm expected to, or on Clubhouse when people make comments, it's like, don't play into that. Told not to speak up, what good English you have, hey, you got an accent, so on and so forth. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I mean, clearly this has been a common experience. And, the issue though is that we needed to kind of be aware that we start to take it in. So this is where it kind of gets into our identity. How does this affect us? We actually have aspects of internalized racism where we start to have shame and maybe start to internalize it in like, in a very colonized way. And so there's research on this that proves that. There's a really good post if you look up Hai Su Yun, internalized racism in the Asian community. Look that up on Instagram. It's an excellent post on how it manifests. And unfortunately, this can impact our relationship with other groups. We perpetuate some of this to other groups, like there was something about being white in the chat. And so if we're rewarded for, working so hard and then we're light skinned, we might start to think, well, we're better, and we might start to think that, I earned this. I have, like the privilege gets twisted, but the privilege is given to us because of the, what we're around in a warped way, like by the stereotype, which is not helpful. So it gets confused and internalized in a way that doesn't actually, help us. Yeah, that in the chat, folks, that's exactly what I'm referring to. So when there are prominent celebrities that utilize the stereotype, I get that they're trying to connect with the audience and have a laugh. It's not good. So I'll give an example. There's someone who was doing a workshop and he was displaying his logos and he happened to be Mexican. He showed all the companies he worked with and he made a joke to the crowd and he said, see, my grandma always told me that Mexicans are hardworking. Like this is an example. It's like, don't play into that. You're playing into white supremacy by playing off the crowd and these stereotypes. So we actually have to stop that and notice when where it can turn into like anti-Blackness, like how it can turn into racism against other communities. And it actually works hand in hand with people targeting us because we might be seen as weaker and we hate other people and so on and so forth. I'm not saying everyone's like that, but that's how this stuff plays out. And I'm sorry to have this hard conversation, but this has to be said. And what's the source of it? It's from systemic racism. It's not something we intentionally actually like wake up trying to do. It just sometimes slips out of our mouth or how it's done to us. Why are seniors in the Asian community targeted? Because of this, because they're seen as fill in the blank. It's painful. So, where do we go from here? Where we go from here is thinking about, our positionality, which is huge in terms of our identity, in terms of our ability to have solidarity, in terms of knowing the traditions we come from and being able to lead, create, and innovate. with those traditions and those values. So what's at the heart of those values that you shared earlier is care for the community, is right. So let's go ahead and put in the chat again, what are the values that you're proud of? What are the values that you're proud of about who you are, that you've been taught? What are things that you bring forth, right? So it's, thinking of others. It could be awareness, highly aware due to our connection to extended family and the household. What else? It could be, having a different communication style is extremely helpful on teams because you can gauge what's going on. Okay, so here we go. Strong family values. We do take care of our community members, each other, and our elders. Flexibility and thoughtfulness, family values and traditions, good emotional intelligence and awareness, and taking care of the people we value, gift giving. These are all amazing things. And so now I'm gonna ask folks to come off mute and answer this question. Knowing our traditions and our cultural values, what can leadership look like? What does leadership look like? What can leadership look like for you? How can you lead with these values? What does it look like? How can it be positioned as a strength?
I can share that I think leadership can be leadership with, leadership together versus like leadership or power over, if that makes sense.
Amazing. Leadership together or leadership with. And that, give us an example of what that would look like.
I think being collaborative and coalition building versus like sometimes people think that when you're a leader, you have to be a certain way, like you have to be dominant, you have to be extroverted, you have to like be very strongly assertive and aggressive. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case.
Amazing, thank you. And I want to say that some of that is tied to gender too, right? So not just ethnic identity, but there are, the components of patriarchy that play into this, right? Like respecting, the different genders that collaborative coalition building can help bring forth. So not only is it helpful to different ethnic groups, but it's also going to affect everybody who's underrepresented, right? If we think that way, we'll be more aware of people who have differing abilities, right? If we are thinking that way, if we're collective minded, like it's almost like a no-brainer. It's like such a well-kept secret. Like clearly, if you are in touch with people, you'll be a better leader. So why is that, right? So that, how do we turn that into strength? I love this. Okay. Can someone else talk about how leadership can look like for them? Like how can you lead with this? Give an example, either through communication or behaving.
I would say that to me, it would look like being patient with different points of view and not make or assume certain things about people just from the way they look or talk, and giving them an actual chance to showcase their talents, and make sure that they have a voice in whatever setting we are in.
This is so amazing. If we think about making sure everyone has a voice and showcasing their talents, I feel like that's the key here, right? Isn't that the key around equity and inclusion? Like you
Yes.
nailed it.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we all lead that way, we won't be defensive. We won't be resistant. We'll be equity minded because we care about each other. And that's what's missing. Right?
Yeah. I think there has to be a broader definition of leadership than what currently exists.
Yes. Agreed. We have here, you get to take the experience and utilize the breadth of everyone's gifts. We have leadership isn't about a position. It's being able to have conversations with people, differing views in leadership. That's another good one, is that hearing other people's viewpoints, right? That as an individualistic perspective, you're going to miss those viewpoints. So this is great. We have another comment about writing about the stories that permeate our society and sharing them more widely. Movies like Farewell and Crazy Rich Asians, or for those of you who have seen Yellow Rose, that's a really powerful one about the Filipino diaspora and immigration. So yes, sharing those stories is going to change and shape everyone around us. So that actually moves into the next point, which is like, what impact can this have? And so what learned lessons can we carry forward, and what impact can be created when we start to think about our strengths in this way, right? So what again, moving forward, remembering our tradition, remember, not in the camp of forgetting it, not in the camp of dismissing ourselves. We're trying to reclaim it because we've been taught that these things are wrong. So instead, what are the things we can take with us? If you had an elder, like who's in this picture right now, sharing to the person who's now coming up as the leader, what can we teach ourselves? You know, what are some things you want to pass on? Okay, actively listen to various perspectives. I think that there's a lot of you know, ownership. Like the reason why hardworking is such a value, it's like taking ownership of everything. Like look at small businesses in America. We have a very high percentage of Asians that have small businesses. Why? People are self-starters, people are problem solvers, people figure it out. They come to a new country with, you know, $300 in their pocket, like my dad did from Pakistan, and he had a dry cleaners and he figured it out, right? Like we figured it out. So there's something to that dynamism of like troubleshooting, figuring out a situation with little information and turning it into a solution. And I think that when we diminish ourselves, like let's say we're not prideful of, you know, our families having small businesses or growing up in a, you know, 1-bedroom apartment and having a restaurant, like that kid in the song. We're missing out on like the richness of that. Richard, question.
Not a question, just going to share my thoughts on
Sure.
this piece.
Thank
To
you.
your point about like lessons learned forward, I've been reflecting lately that I feel like the attacks of the last year, not just the last few months, right, have really pushed a lot of Asian and Asian American folks to grapple with the fact that like building wealth and economic security doesn't shield us from racism, right? There are things that like these attacks are very visible on the street, and they're a very visible reminder of that. And so I feel like one of the lessons that I really want to push forward as a hopeful future ancestor is this piece around like, yes, hustle, grind, all of that, but also like civic engagement, activism, coalition with other marginalized people, right? Like there's just like a lot of stuff about being an American that's not okay. And like we have to engage with all that stuff too, alongside all of the professional dreams and aspirations.
Yes, use our civic liberties to make society better for all, for us and for all. Appreciate that. Now, what we're going to turn to is some of us, most of us, many of us are ERG leaders. And the question is, how can ERGs help bring about that awareness? And so let's pivot into kind of like what's next. And so what we can do here is a couple things. So I want to actually turn to what our strategies moving forward, what you can do. So some tips here. The first thing is knowing yourself and history, your own history. So really sitting down, whether it be going for a walk, thinking about it, talking it over with a friend, or journaling, like, how do you define yourself, right? Like when someone asks you that question, the where are you from, or what are you, or who are you? Like, are you upfront about it, or do you sort of like hide it? And I remember growing up, I used to hide who I was. I tried to just go with it. Like, do you correct people when they mispronounce your name? And the thing that was shared earlier about people who've changed their names, like those are all really huge pain points. So are you able to reclaim that? The first step is knowing yourself. Okay. The second thing is, what are you proud of about your history and community? And so we named some things like the values, and also there could be other things that you're proud of. So what contributions, or even like purely existing, the presence, the culture, the teachings, what are you proud of? It doesn't have to be something quantifiable, like we built this thing or invented that thing, right? It doesn't have to be that materialistic. And then at the same time, like start to interrogate, like, what is challenging? What myths have you internalized that you actually hold? What do you find the hardest to overcome, and what do you need support with? So ERGs and the fact that they're affinity based can help create this dialogue. So use the spaces that you have to go through this process with your group. Go through this process so that people don't bypass and just focus on, what Richard was saying about like wealth or career, or, when you get into the trajectory where you miss this part and just focus on success, then this will keep coming back. We'll never get past it. And people who come here from different countries now versus have lived here also have different understandings of this. So even that dialogue about what an Asian person is, or who that is like actually really healthy. I really care for the adopted community. I think that the Asian adopted community is a lot of the time overlooked, and they have a very different experience than others, and multiple generations have different experiences. So have a dialogue about this, reflect, and use that ERG to empower this conversation, and then become united. Reflection and opportunities moving forward are these, and this can be something that we discuss. What does your ERG represent as an opportunity for you to do? What can it create as a distinct space? What does it allow for? How do we honor and represent our Asian values and community preferences? And what resources and support do you need? So I want to just open this up for a second. Let's be creative. What can an ERG do in terms of this reclaiming?
I'll share one thing that's just coming to my mind right now, is that in the past, I used to be really fearful to share my opinion or ideas in work-related meetings, because I used to think that, oh, my opinion doesn't matter, it might be wrong. And I just wouldn't like I wouldn't share my voice. And I think that it takes practice to do that. And so maybe ERGs can be like a safe space for people to do that, and for us to recognize that it is because of our unique perspectives that we need to share our voices. Like, what if we have an idea because of our experience and because of our background and because of our perspective that no one else in the room might think of? And if we're not sharing that, we're doing a disservice to everyone because we're not putting that idea or that perspective out there. So I'm done speaking. Thank you.
Right on. Well said. Thank you. Would anyone else like to share? You know, ERGs have a lot of power. There's a lot of power right now. And generally, we're able to utilize the united nature of that voice to move policy, to move decisions, and to move action. So not only is it a place for collectively creating affinity, it is a place for advocacy. And I really want us to encourage thinking about that the reclaiming can also happen around pointing out what is not helpful or asking for resources. I'll give you an example where I was helping host an ERG meeting and a woman came on, she had her camera off and she apologized to the group and she's like, I can't come on camera. I just found out my grandfather was attacked. And she was crying and it was like, because she had this space to share, she hadn't shared with her team, like her work team, because she had this space, the executive sponsor who was white heard that. I got to offline with her and we talked about mental health support and it changed the entire policy in that company where now certain sick time or whatnot is like available for mental health time and they got some other resources. That changed the entire policy for everybody. It benefited everybody. But it's because she spoke up. She said something about her grandfather. Now, if she kept that to herself and there wasn't a space, that would have continued. She wouldn't have that support, nor would anyone. So I want us to think about the power we have collectively. Remember the value of the collective and leadership. We have here, ERGs can advocate for our communities and causes, activate and engage corporate leaders. And that's what ALA is doing. So shout out to ALA for being a collective that we can leverage and connect with each other on. That's the coalition building. That is actually, if you think about it, the spirit of ERGs and ALA and us together. That's the united front. So, you know, just to kind of bring it home for you, let's talk about what we wish to see for our community, what's possible, how we can reimagine the future, and what's an ideal state for all of us. I'm excited about that. I have said how we are in a very difficult time. Our community has been ravaged with so much this year, but we are able to speak on this and people are listening. So how do we want to use this time, this privilege we have of being leaders? Okay, so can you put in the chat or you can come off mute. What's one thing you wish to see? One thing you wish to create? One impact you want to have moving forward? We have more openness to share. We have, I hope we can create a place where young Asian kids feel happy to be Asian rather than ashamed. And that goes for adults too. Like, we're all grown children. We're somebody's child, and it's still how we feel. People being mobilized to advocate more for our communities. So solidarity with other communities or our own. Would love to see people proud and happy about their heritage. Yes. So, that we all have equal respect of each other and equity of opportunities. Take this and you'll think about it, write it down, take it back to your G, take it back to other people you know, or even reflect on it yourself. Because this is what this moment is for. It's for reclaiming who we are, honoring it, not forgetting it, every part of it, and then creating impact with our power. We have here a really broad sense of care and inclusion for all folks under the Asian American umbrella, especially ones who don't get a spotlight. Communicate leadership has a broader definition. Yes, that's great. And so I want us to all think about this. And can you please write it down somewhere? What do you want to see in the future? And this is our collective commitment here as a group and people viewing this. Like, what is it that we want to collectively commit to? And these are all really great. So as we wrap up here, a great reminder about this initiative about our names and reclaiming that, if that feels comfortable for you and supportive of you. There's information in the chat there. I want to kind of bring it home. Usually there's an inspirational quote we leave on. And instead, I'm going to leave with you an image. And it is one of the generational torch passing, that legacy that we've been left with. I know each of us has a story of an elder who sacrificed or who was so committed to the future. And that is why we're here. And so it's our responsibility to make a difference for future generations. And it's for our heroes who came before us, our ancestors, and our future generations. So one thing I would like to invite us to do, and this is something we can all try, is this. Think about what you would say to your family that you haven't expressed yet. I think we're in a time where we're coping and trying to get through, but we need to break through the silence on this. Okay, that's part of the healing and empowerment, and talk to our family. Say one thing. So what would that one thing be? And if you feel like you want to share in the chat, you can do that, or you can DM me and I can read it out. My parents were working 6 days a week. We didn't really go on family vacations. My mom was a nurse and she had late shifts and whatnot. So I think I would call them and just, thank them for what they've done and keep committing to making the world better. So you can do that, or you can talk to a child in your family. We have here, you did the best you did with what you had, and I'm grateful. We have here, I will talk to my son to be proud of who he is. We have, I'm proud of you for giving me the opportunity to be your voices now. To my parents, you didn't sacrifice everything as immigrants for me to just be here to make money and not be myself. We have a comment about being an international student and how this is so amazing to be a part of, to have this explained. Thank you. We have a comment. This is to the family. I'm sorry for everything you had to go through to give me the life I have here now, but I will use my voice to make sure that you are heard. So you see how that gives us purpose? It gives us a reason to keep trying, right? To keep going. And on this final note, this comment here is, I see you and what you had to deal with, and it is now on us to move our communities forward for the next generation. I'm so honored to have this conversation with you today. I want to thank you for joining. I just noticed the time. We can move into the next part, but you know, the key here is just to recap, knowing yourself, reclaiming that, creating this paradigm of who we are, expressing it, using ERGs to help further a cause and action, and then looping back with where this all came from, our family, and expressing it to them, what you're doing. So that's our presentation for today. I want to thank you all for being here, and appreciate any comments and also staying in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzana, for that really powerful.
Thank you.
Touches the heart, really, for what you said and what you've done for the community. I guess before we go on to networking session, does anyone have any questions for Farzana?
Or maybe what folks have taken away even.
This was very inspiring to me. I think some of the things, I think most of us who are here today obviously believe some of the things you talked about, but I've never had a situation where I've had a chance to discuss this in an open forum. So some deep-seated thoughts that are sometimes true, sometimes a mixture. So just having that, to take the time to discuss this has been very good. And if you would please share your contact information for a minute, 1 minute. My power went out and I missed a couple of slides. Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe Richard has something to say. Go for it.
Thank you so much. Thanks. I think that was Jimmy, right? Thanks, Jimmy. I have a question, Farzana, and we may not have time to get this is a kind of one I've been grappling with for a couple of months now. I feel like I am a little bit stuck in thinking about my own identity, in the sense that when I first started to be very critical and conscious of my identity, I really distanced myself from thinking about and connecting with folks in Asia, or like very recent Asian immigrants. For me, it was helpful to distill like Asian American versus Asian to help me like think about perpetual foreigner myth, right? Think about like different conditions growing up, being a person of color in this country, just like different childhood things, right? But the last few months, especially with the attacks, which I mentioned earlier, have really pushed me to broaden my thinking, right? And to like think about like, well, what are the shared connections that I have with folks that look like me, but don't have the same childhood lived experiences that I do, right? And that experience of being a person of color in the racial hierarchy of the US. And I just feel myself kind of stuck because there is so much about, for me, the experience of growing up here that I feel like really constructs the view that I have, right? And like the traumas and the strengths and all of that. To your point around like navigating collectivist cultural values in an individualist society, right? Like there's like a lot of that I'm grappling with that makes sense to me. And I am stuck in terms of this piece of building coalition or building relationships with folks that don't have those lived experiences, but in the last few months have experienced very similar things, right? I really have a clear question here. Clearly I'm stuck, right? I'm just curious if you
Yeah,
have any thoughts on this.
I think it's such a beautiful question because until this year, we maybe didn't have as much in common, right? And there's a gap there. I think it's pronounced in our community, maybe more so than other communities, or maybe just the same. But there's economic reasons for that gap. So I don't want us to internalize the fact that it's us or them or whoever you are. It's due to immigration policy that people who have access and privilege, be it through school or work or money, can come to this country. So that's already a selection bias. So, right? So if you look at Little Tokyo in LA, it's generations of people who came who were, laborers who are now elders. And then folks who come here from Japan, they also in their own community have a disconnect, right? Because of immigration. So again, the forces, the systemic forces create a wedge in our own communities. Whereas if we lived with each other, we would be in contact with each other. So we've got to dismantle the source of it. First of all, know that we're united. And this was another layer of the diaspora that created this gap. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I do think that this year has brought everyone together, right? Wherever you started from, we're all at the same point, okay? Where we've been discriminated against overtly with 4,000 acts of violence and more in shootings. And it's just been horrific in every community, not just the East Asian community, Filipinos, South Asian, it's everybody. So we have this time now, this opportunity to galvanize. And sometimes having a united cause, whether it be bad or good, is how that comes together. We are tied together in a knot, whether we like it or not. We are united. So let's use that. And I think the answer is to have more dialogue and just keep talking about it. And I got a DM about someone who's adopted. And it's like, that's right. That's why I brought up being adopted. People who are adopted are just finding out about their Asian heritage now. They grew up, let's say, with a white family and had no idea. And now are lumped in with this, right? So let's keep talking.
Your point about living together is really interesting. Thank you, Farzana. The other thing I was also going to share for you and for everyone else, I actually have a friend who's doing research on Asian American identity. And the knot metaphor is actually something that's a cornerstone of her research. So that's just interesting. Yeah.
I
should put you on
that.
touch. Should put you on touch.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Thanks, Farzana. And I guess I have a question. Maybe if everyone else would could relate to this, but how would you communicate to your parents of your, that you grew up with an American identity and an Asian identity, so they would want you to, be that Asian identity, but you feel like you have both. How would you communicate that to them?
I think there's healing all around. Like some parents want us to forget our Asian identity, right? And not learn the language. And then there's some people who say, keep your identity, don't forget your Asian. I think that it's a give and take. We're both. And how do you communicate that back? I think there's healing in that, just starting to talk about it again and honoring who they are and where they're at, and knowing that to be honest with you, any conflict that comes with a different generation, it comes from fear. Right? The reason why seniors act the way they do is because they're, you know, they're sacred in our community, but they have less power and physical like strength. And so they're hardened in their ways to protect themselves. So that is something, if we can offer and inject empathy into that and just know that that's going to happen, like that's what it is. I remember sitting on the sofa with my grandmother who's from Pakistan, originally from India, and you know, marriage was becoming legalized between two gay people. And I was trying to explain it to her, and she has limited English, and she was at, you know, 85 at the time. And I was like, you know what? I think I'm just gonna let her be. You know what I mean? Like, I think that at this point, like let's just keep it like real simple here. And you know, and I have a cousin who's gay, and so like she can understand. We don't have to hit them hard with like awareness, like I need to do this, I need to do that. Like she understood this is her friend. Like we need to be culturally sensitive in how we offer up advocacy or offer up who we are. We have to flex to the elders and the people in our community, and of course advocate. But like we don't, again, this is an individualistic way of what advocacy looks like. I have in-laws who are in Malaysia. My husband's Malaysian and German. And there's, you know, sure, it's a Muslim country, but people like coexist and live as gay people there, right? It's just not the same type of like hard-hitting kind of way that we do advocacy. So I want to challenge all the conceptions we have about like how we stand up for ourselves.
Yeah, that's on point right there. It's because of the generational gap, and you have to hit them with empathy and understand where they come from. So that's perfect. And I'm still working with that as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you.